There's a certain kind of person who doesn't just experience life, they analyze it. Conversations don't simply end, they replay in their mind. Decisions are never just decisions, they become branching possibilities filled with imagined outcomes. Even small moments carry layers of meaning that most people would overlook entirely. To an outside observer, this looks like overthinking. But internally, it feels like trying to understand everything before anything has the chance to go wrong. This is not simply a habit of thinking more. It is a pattern shaped by how the brain processes uncertainty, emotion, and control. At its core, overthinking is deeply connected to the brain's predictive system. The human mind is designed to anticipate outcomes as a way to reduce risk, but in people who think excessively, this mechanism becomes hyperactive. Instead of preparing for reality, it begins constructing endless scenarios. Every what-if branches into another, creating a loop that feels productive but rarely leads to resolution. The more the mind searches for certainty, the more it becomes aware of how many variables exist. This is why overthinkers often feel mentally exhausted even when nothing is physically happening, because internally, everything is happening at once. Neurologically, this tendency is often linked to increased activity in the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for planning, decision-making, and self-reflection. While this can result in deeper insight and awareness, it also makes it difficult for the brain to disengage. For these individuals, thinking is not something they turn on. It is something that is always running in the background. Even during moments of rest, their mind continues to process, evaluate, and simulate possibilities. This constant activity creates a sense of mental noise that is hard to silence. However, overthinking is not purely cognitive, it is emotional. People who think too much are often highly sensitive to emotional shifts, both in themselves and in others. They don't just notice what happens, they analyze what it means, how it felt, and what it could imply for the future. This depth of emotional processing can lead to strong empathy and awareness, but it also increases vulnerability to emotional overload. When feelings become intense or unclear, the mind attempts to manage them through analysis. The belief, often unconscious, is that if something can be fully understood, it can be controlled. This is where overthinking begins to function as a coping mechanism. It creates an illusion of control in situations that are inherently uncertain. By mentally rehearsing outcomes, the individual feels more prepared, more protected. But this strategy has a paradoxical effect. Instead of reducing uncertainty, it amplifies it. Each new possibility introduces additional doubt, making decisions more difficult rather than easier. Overthinkers are not indecisive because they lack clarity, they struggle because they see too much of it. Every option contains potential risks, and the desire to avoid mistakes becomes stronger than the desire to act. Past experiences also play a significant role in shaping this pattern. Individuals who have been criticized, misunderstood, or emotionally hurt often develop heightened self-awareness as a form of protection. They begin to monitor their behavior more closely, analyzing interactions in an attempt to prevent future negative outcomes. Over time, this self-monitoring becomes automatic. Conversations are reviewed, words are reconsidered, and subtle reactions are interpreted repeatedly. This is not simply insecurity, it is learned vigilance. The mind is trying to ensure that nothing is overlooked again. Social situations, in particular, tend to trigger overthinking loops. After an interaction ends, it continues internally. A simple exchange can turn into a prolonged analysis of tone, timing, and meaning. Even neutral or positive interactions can be reinterpreted as potentially flawed. This happens because overthinkers are highly attuned to ambiguity. They notice what is not explicitly stated, and in the absence of clear information, the brain attempts to fill in the gaps. Unfortunately, it often fills them with worst-case interpretations rather than neutral ones. Perfectionism is another layer that reinforces this behavior. Many overthinkers hold themselves to high internal standards, not only in their actions, but in how they are perceived by others. They want to respond correctly, behave appropriately, and avoid missteps. As a result, they spend more time thinking before acting. This creates a delay between intention and execution, where thoughts accumulate faster than decisions. Even after acting, the evaluation continues, often focusing on what could have been improved rather than what went well. This constant refinement process becomes mentally draining over time. Despite its challenges, overthinking is not inherently negative. In fact, It is often associated with intelligence, creativity, and emotional depth. People who think deeply are more likely to reflect, question, and understand complex dynamics. They are capable of seeing multiple perspectives and anticipating outcomes that others might miss. The issue is not the depth of thinking, it is the inability to disengage from it. When thinking becomes repetitive rather than constructive, it stops being a tool and starts becoming a trap. One of the defining characteristics of overthinking is the shift from useful thinking to looping thought patterns. Useful thinking leads to insight, clarity, or action. Looping thoughts, on the other hand, revisit the same idea without producing new understanding. They feel active, but they are static. Overthinkers often struggle to distinguish between the two, which is why the process feels productive even when it is not. This creates a cycle where the individual continues to invest mental energy without receiving resolution in return. Silence can intensify this experience. Without external input, the mind turns inward, amplifying its own activity. Thoughts become more noticeable, more persistent, and more difficult to ignore. This is why many overthinkers gravitate toward constant stimulation, music, podcasts, or background noise. These are not just forms of entertainment. They act as buffers that reduce the intensity of internal dialogue. By occupying part of the mind, they create temporary relief from the cycle of overanalysis. Over time, overthinking can become integrated into identity. It is no longer seen as a behavior, but as a personality trait. Statements like, "I'm just someone who overthinks," reinforce this perception, making change feel unlikely or even undesirable. There is often a fear that reducing this pattern might lead to carelessness or poor decisions. However, thinking less does not mean thinking worse. It means becoming more selective about where attention is directed. A critical psychological shift involves recognizing that not every thought requires analysis. The brain generates a constant stream of ideas, many of which are neutral or irrelevant. Overthinkers tend to assign importance to a larger portion of these thoughts, treating them as signals that need to be decoded. Learning to let thoughts pass without engagement reduces their intensity over time. This does not eliminate thinking, it changes the relationship with it. As awareness develops, the pattern becomes easier to identify. The moment a thought begins to repeat without adding new insight, it can be recognized as a loop rather than a problem to solve. This awareness creates a point of interruption. Instead of continuing the cycle, attention can be redirected. With practice, this reduces the overall frequency and intensity of overthinking episodes. The long-term effect of this shift is not silence, but clarity. Thoughts still exist, but they no longer dominate attention in the same way. Decisions become more fluid, interactions feel more natural, and experiences are less filtered through constant analysis. The individual remains thoughtful, but not trapped in thought. Ultimately, overthinking is not about having too many thoughts. It is about using thinking as the primary way to manage uncertainty and emotion. It reflects a deeper need for safety in an environment that cannot be fully controlled. Once this is understood, the goal is not to eliminate thinking, but to expand beyond it, to allow action, experience, and uncertainty to coexist without constant analysis.